All right. Thank you. Thank you for that motivation, Miss Aretha Franklin. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really grateful to be having this conversation today. My name is Zoë Polk. I'm the Executive Director of the East Bay Community Law Center. And I'm so grateful for you all for participating. And I'm particularly grateful to Savala and Rachel for holding space with me on this anniversary occasion, this 1 year that we have been in our current state of shelter in place, COVID, all the things. For folks who don't know, I am the new kid. I am a huge fan of both Savala and Rachel. They have a long body of work at Berkeley Law, and I couldn't think of anyone better to be in conversation with as we reflect and predict on what's coming in 2021, and particularly for Black women. The three of us started this conversation about this event in around January. And this was coming off the heels of a national conversation about the role of Black women in quote unquote saving the country via the Georgia elections. Also organizing and winning defund police movements across the country. And helping the Democrats win the presidency, which arguably Kamala Harris had a big hand in doing. These are all such significant wins for Black women, but also very significant wins for our country. And yet, in thinking about those wins, we also have to think about what it's like to live the reality of Black womanhood. And I wanted to interrogate the statement of trust Black women, which is something that just kind of pops up anytime in all those key moments, and certainly come in some of the moments we're talking about today. And I think it's really important to think about this sentiment against the backdrop of Black women being overrepresented in COVID-related unemployment, of Black women being overrepresented in still health disparities, some COVID-related, and many of them are pre-pandemic related. And how are we thinking about this as attorneys, as lawyers, as Savala, Rachel, and I all are? One of the things that I heard today, just in the course of me doing my business as a Black woman lawyer, was that there are 5 Black women judges out of 179 federal judges on the appellate court, circuit court. And then there are 42 Black women on the district court out of 673. And of course, no Black women in the Senate. So it's a very interesting place to be in. We have this sentiment, we have this, I feel like, a national conversation about gratitude towards Black women, but then seeing how we're represented, particularly in places of power, and particularly in our profession, our chosen profession. So the title of this event is Trust Black Women with a question mark. And that question mark is meant to acknowledge the distance between this statement and our lived day-to-day reality. So thank you all for joining what I hope and imagine will be a bold and powerful discussion. So I want to start with some introductions. You've heard a little bit about me and what brings me to this conversation. I would love to hear from, I'm going to invite Rachel and Savala to join us and talk a little bit, introduce themselves and their work, and also what interests you about this conversation about trust Black women, particularly in this moment now. So Rachel, do you want to start?
Sure thing. My name is Rachel Johnson-Farias, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice out of Berkeley Law, and ESQ Apprentice, an Oakland-based nonprofit helping low-income women of color become lawyers without law school and without debt via legal apprenticeship. I guess I'll start with just, by way of introduction, shouting out all the people pandemic parenting right now. You may or may not see my children run through, but that's been a big interest for me when we first started talking about this. Is motherhood and parenting is so difficult anyway. Under COVID, it's been almost impossible, and the impacts on Black women have just been so great. How are we talking about taking care of one another? How are we talking about we have all these corporate statements saying to trust Black women, and yet, Black women working in corporations are going unsupported, especially during this pandemic. So I just am so excited and honored. Thank you, Zoe and Savala, to be in conversation with both of you. And I'll turn over to Savala for introductions.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Zoe, for bringing me into the space. I'm excited to be here too. I'm Savala, and I direct the Thelton E Henderson Center for Social Justice at the law school, which is a joy and a privilege to do. And I'm also an alum of the law school. So I come into this communal space kind of wearing two hats, one as a former student, current alum, and one as someone who's part of the infrastructure of the law school. And I also teach as a lecturer for hire, not a tenure track professor, but the other kind of instructor. And in addition to that, I write, and I spend a lot of time thinking about Blackness and bodies and womanhood in ways that sort of have nothing to do with the law. So I bring that to this table too, and I'm just thrilled to be here.
Thank you, Savala. Thank you, both of you, for I think the way that we're going to have a colorful conversation, holding all the things. I think a good starting place for us would be to think about what movement lawyering is, and specifically what is Black women centered movement lawyering. All of us work in distinct areas. So Rachel, primarily in reproductive justice, Savala, very much engaged in educating future lawyers and people who are readers of your work. And then I in direct services. So I imagine that all of us, even among the three of us, we may have different definitions of what movement lawyering is. And then I want to expand this even greater to see the folks who are tuning in with us. I definitely want to invite, if you are a movement lawyer or you are an aspiring movement lawyer, I would love for you to show us some love in the comments on Facebook, and just tell us, share who you are, what you're, that you're a movement lawyer, and then also we want to invite people who are watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments. If you are not logged into Facebook, you can also email questions via news@ebclc.org. So the thing I think of when I think of movement lawyering is getting out of the way. And particularly getting out of the way of community folks and activists from communities of color. In my experience, I have known that it's important to use the capital that we get from the capital that I've gotten from my legal degree and my legal education, to help the law work for people instead of telling people, particularly Black people, what the law will and will not allow them to do. Because this, the basis here, the threshold here is that the law was not designed was not set up to protect Black people, and certainly not protect and uphold the dignity of Black women in particular. So when I think of Black women movement lawyering, I think about what our responsibility is to essentially figure out how to, to hear the more imaginative and great ideas from community folks, and how do we get out of the way of those, but also how do we support those? And I'd love to hear from, Rachel and Savala, like what is your approach to movement lawyering, and then also what does it look like from your area of expertise? How about Savala? Do you want to start?
Sure. I'm relatively new to thinking of myself as someone who can even approach claiming to be a movement lawyer. I think because, well, for all kinds of reasons, but probably first and foremost because I'm part of this big, bulky institution, as opposed to being, involved in direct services or out on the streets. I'm sort of in my office, or I'm like behind a podium, or I'm alone writing, So I'm new to thinking of myself as someone who is ostensibly or partially involved in movement lawyering. Zoe, I love your frame about getting out of the way, and I love how it's sort of so the opposite of what people are taught in law school. Like, we're kind of taught to get in the way and to insert ourselves and to dump out our massive bag of, unique powers and start showing them off for people. And I like this idea of getting out of the way. And I can't wait to hear what Rachel has to say. But what I will add to that comes from the work that I do in the class that I co-teach with Seema Patel, who will be a familiar name and face for some of you, about movement lawyering. Because I think that movement lawyering involves it involves an interrogation of who you center, right? Whether you're centering yourself as the lawyer, or the people that you're serving and that you're working with. sort of whose vision you center, whose goals you center, you know, whose sense of what's possible you center, because it involves all of that. I think that it raises the question of how clearly we're able to see people and to see them as human beings who, you know, are just as rich with knowledge as we are as attorneys, if not richer, you know, given the particular context of the movement lawyering. And it involves being able to see people, you know, through a clear lens, a lens that is not fogged up and scratched up and marked up with bias, you know, to the extent possible. Because when you're looking at people through a lens of bias, you know, you don't see them, it's harder to respect them, it's harder to make room for them, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think of movement lawyering as involving an ongoing, rigorous interrogation that the attorney needs to do in terms of the kind of biases that are just sort of like hovering between them and their communities, or them and their clients, and also that they have internalized about themselves that may get in the way of them sort of like fully activating their own power in the best way possible. Like if I have swallowed a bunch of garbage messages about myself as a woman and a Black person and a fat person, it is harder for me to be maximally powerful in any space, including a movement lawyering space. And if I've absorbed all of that toxic stuff about other people and I'm seeing other people through those same kind of tarnished lenses, it's going to be harder for me to work with them and get out of the way, and all of those things that that Zoe mentioned. So I think of it as being a sort of identity-rich practice, and a practice that involves a lot of interrogation of the self.
Absolutely. You're here.
I think that's right. And when I was thinking about movement lawyering, and the thing that kept coming up for me, the phrase that kept coming up for me was not a moment, but a movement. And I think those are technically Hamilton lyrics, right? But the movement for Black lives, which I'll just, as an aside, will say is not over. The Black Lives Matter movement is still ongoing. The cameras aren't rolling, but the movement's still going. Not a moment, but a movement. So when I think about that and apply a reproductive justice lens to that phrase, not a moment, but a movement, I think we end up with a really holistic approach to movement lawyering. And so kind of to take a step back, for those who don't know, reproductive justice is a movement that started in 1994 in Chicago by, you guessed it, Black women. And these, I think it was 11 to 15 Black women came together, and in response to the pro-choice movement, right? That there are all these feminists and activists saying we need choice, we need, you know, all these things when it comes to abortion. But what these Black women interrogated was, how can you make this a conversation about choice if you don't have access to meaningful choice, right? Like so many low-income women of color don't. So in their infinite wisdom, these Black women distilled reproductive justice into 3 kind of tenets, right? That everyone has a right to have a family, to not have a family, and to raise the families we do have in safety and with dignity and respect. I think those first 2 tenets get a lot of focus, have a family or not, right? People are very interested in abortion and contraception, as they should be. They're really important. But what gets less attention, and what I think's been under particular attack during this year in COVID, in the pandemic, is the ability to raise one's family in safety and with dignity and respect. And so, you know, what we've seen in terms of, for example, evictions going on, that so many Black women, Black families are being taken out of forced out of their homes. I don't even think we know the extent to how that, you know, how deep that really is. How can you raise your family in safety if you're not housed, right? If you're looking at, as Zoe mentioned, the job loss, that Black and brown women bore the brunt of almost all job loss in the United States in December 2020. How can you raise your family with dignity and respect if you don't have a living wage, right? So reproductive justice kind of applies this intersectional frame rooted in human rights. And when I think about how to apply that frame to movement lawyering, I think it demands, reproductive justice demands a shift in how we think about lawyering, right? That we have to go beyond the moment of, okay, what's your contact with the law? Why are you here? Let me address this issue. And go beyond to the movement and say, okay, now what do you and your family need to thrive? Right? And I would say that that's a radical shift in thinking about the law, except that the law tends to work that way for wealthy people already. Right? We have these popular cases of parents who commit crimes, and the judge tries to give them as much time under house arrest and spread out their actual time inside jail or prison so that they never lose custody of their children. I mean, that's something that low-income families just don't get that luxury. And Black women especially don't get that luxury, right? So the law does tend to kind of work as that affirmative question, what do you need to thrive, to wealthy people? I think the shift that's radical when you apply reproductive justice is you start to think about, okay, how can the law work for low-income people, which Zoe and Savala already highlighted. It just doesn't as of yet. So when I think about movement lawyering, that's really what I'm thinking about. It's like, if we apply a reproductive justice frame, if we think of the law as a tool to get people to a point of thriving, well, then I think every approach, every legal question, it's a bit more holistic. It doesn't just deal with the immediate issue, not just the moment, but the movement, to stability.
That's such it's, in some senses it's radical. Just let's think about our role as, how do we help people thrive? How do we help our clients thrive? And certainly goes from a lens of, when we think about who the law did not include when architects made it, how do we make sure those folks are centered, right? Those are two, not radical, doesn't seem like, but they are in the context of the way that the law is working and not working for folks now. And it certainly, for me, surfaces critical race theory, right? And I 100% believe that institutionalizing a critical race theory curriculum is imperative to the transformative change that communities of color need, and that, frankly, the entire country needs, as I stated earlier about some of the victories that we had. And I think it really provides a tools that, Rachel, you were talking about that constant interrogation. People can be mixed about whether they think they're a movement lawyer, whether they want to be a movement lawyer. But I think the interrogating yourself, interrogating what your role is and how you're using the law and how you're using your privilege to benefit our society is important. And I think critical race theory really, if nothing else, provides that interrogation. Because you spoke earlier, Savala, too, just about, like, how are we thinking about decentering ourselves? And thinking about how we're kind of in a place of consistently learning. So those are, that's certainly that comes to mind, especially all of us are lecturers or engaged in educating students. Like, we are essentially saying yes to a collective responsibility of how we're helping future lawyers benefit their clients, benefit all of us vis-a-vis the public policy that they make and jurisprudence that they will put out.
I think that's, yeah, I agree completely. And I think, the law's role, it's, when we say trust Black women, how should I put this? It means creating an environment where we can speak our truth in a safe way. And, the truth of the law is that it is fundamentally, like almost by definition, this tool of oppression that's meant to maintain the status quo, right? Like, and to your point about critical race theory, race might have been something that people created, but the law codified it in our country, right? So this idea that, and then tied it to citizenship and all these different things in ways that demands that we dissect those, the law a little more from that perspective, I think obliges us as movement lawyers to really interrogate, okay, yes, we're learning the law, but I hope you also know we're learning a lot of status quo. And if you want to push and innovate and change, then you're going to have to apply a different lens, perhaps a critical theory one, right, to this legal education, just to push back on the norms, because the norms are that we Black women get left behind and left out of a lot of those privileges that the law affords to some folks.
Yeah. I go ahead, Savala.
I just wanted to jump in since you brought up the critical race theory. I just wanted to jump in to say that I agree with both of you, and I hope that Berkeley Law moves to the forefront on this issue and finds a way to lift up critical race theory and embed it in the curriculum in a way that touches all of our future graduates. I mean, to me, having a law school that doesn't graduate people who are at least conversant in how race and law interact, it's like having like a French culinary school that like doesn't have a unit on like patisserie or something. Like there's something missing, right?
That's desserts, right?
Yes. There's something missing, and we've gotten away with it as a community. I don't mean just Berkeley Law, I just mean legal institutions have gotten away with it. But part of why the Henderson Center created the Race and Law Scholarship was to try and like push the ball forward on this question of how can we ensure that our students are maximally prepared to do powerful work. That means being able to understand and talk about and ask questions about race and law. I mean, it's foundational, it's germane, it's like 101. And you need only spend a few minutes looking at the history of law in this country to get that. It's just a question, I think, now of political will and moral courage and priorities and all of that stuff. But I don't think there's a strong argument for not including critical race theory as something that has to be reckoned with in some form or fashion by law students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Rachel talked earlier about, we all of us knew and were in communication about the statements that went up in June, around Juneteenth. There was this energy that I was very conflicted about personally. It seemed to me like what we thought it was this like there were people who were viewing this as a moment that needed to issue a press release, and they weren't thinking about the work that is going to be required to match the words in those statements. And I think that as we endeavor to want to think about how do we make that real, when there was this energy and it seemed to be in some senses a collective awakening about racism in this country, I think what a lot of us feared in terms of that energy dying down is coming to fruition in some respects. But I do think, if I could submit, I don't know if this is controversial, one of the benefits of folks being at home, particularly law students, is that you're not in a bubble of an institution. And so defund police, thinking about student debt in a broader way, I think by the nature of students having to be, on the computer and then in their own worlds, not in a classroom, I think is conducive to them wanting to be engaged, wanting to know how their legal education engages them in these current movements, and wanting to know how they can plug into that. And I'd certainly, want to say for any students who are watching, we would love to hear from you directly about, how are you thinking about your legal education in tandem to the movements that are going on in this country, particularly the movements that are Black women led in this country. Savala, you mentioned earlier that you write in addition to being an attorney and a lecturer, and as I said earlier, I'm a fan of your work. And you and you were published. One of the places that you've written, you were published in Vogue this summer, talking about the life of Breonna Taylor and specifically how it relates to what you know about your grandmother's life. And I wanted to read just one thing that really one piece that you wrote that really resonated with me. I said, in the bodies of Black and brown women, time seems to function differently. The past and the present collapse into each other, and the future seems to lead to things that we've already seen. The future seems to lead to things that we've already seen. So unpack that for us, Savala. In this moment, as of March 2021, unpack that for us.
Yeah, well, dang, we don't have time for me to unpack it all the way, but I can start. So I wrote this piece, and it was inspired by what happened to Breonna Taylor. I wrote it last summer. And I'll just say I always feel conflicted discussing this piece or sort of similar pieces because, one hates to draw attention to oneself through a tragedy that impacted someone else, much more acutely. So I don't know, it's a funny piece for me to talk about in that way. But that being said, I wrote this piece about my great-great-grandmother who was murdered in 1898 in a very similar way to Breonna Taylor. She was shot in her house. She was Black at night and killed by like vigilantes, law enforcement in Texas. And I was wrestling with what had happened to Breonna Taylor and thinking about my great-great-grandmother, whose name was Laura, and feeling overwhelmed and sad and angry about the constancy of those types of occurrences. And I had this sense of sort of, how much of things changed if what happened to Breonna Taylor, several months ago at that time is exactly what happened to my great-great-grandmother 120 years ago. And neither of them received justice, right? Any measure of real justice. So that's where the piece came from. And I wrote about, the body and sort of the Black female body as this place where the past and the present collapse, and where the future looks like something we've already seen. Because I'm not, proffering a universal truth here, but in my life, most of what I know is based on my body. It's based on what my body experiences, how people see my body, what people think about my body, right? Like that, my body is the center of knowledge for me. And I think that's true for a lot of people who are not in bodies that society protects and loves, right? Your brain carries a certain kind of knowledge, but your body carries a different knowledge that can be more complex and more true and complicate the sort of agreed upon narrative. To be more specific, we have an agreed upon narrative, like if we're all going to toe the party line of racial progress in this country, that things are getting better, we're not slaves, we're not enslaved anymore, which is true, right? There is some linear progress in certain ways, but our bodies know that the story is way more complicated than that. Our bodies are where we experience the oppressions, right? And the joys, but in the context of this conversation, the wrongdoing and the trespass lands on our bodies as Black women in particular. Our bodies tell the story of a culture that doesn't change and that fundamentally doesn't transform. So we see the past and the present kind of collapsing into each other is what I was writing about and what I was trying to capture with that phrase. What happened to my great-great-grandmother, what happened to Breonna Taylor, past, present, just sort of colliding. And I don't know that there's a strong indication that the future doesn't look like the past. Another way to say that is I believe there will be another Breonna Taylor. There may already have been, and it hasn't risen to the level of, consciousness in the culture where we're all talking about it. I don't want to take up too much time on this, but I hope that I'm kind of unpacking it, Zoe. If I'm missing something that you wanted me to get at, tell me so I can get there. But yeah, I think the knowledge of the body is incredibly powerful, and it's overlooked in our circles, our intellectual circles. And the knowledge of the body is often a lot more complicated than the mainstream knowledge that we're given. And so it's a source of wisdom in my life, and it's a source of like political wisdom, not just like woo-woo wisdom, but like hardcore intelligence and wisdom. And that's where I was going with that part of that piece.
So I don't know, Zoe, if you had Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I was also going to say that if folks are interested in reading the article, we put that in the comments on Facebook. But go ahead, Rachel.
I thought it was beautiful. Savala's a wonderful writer. I hope you all check out her book, Mid-July. Am I allowed to plug? Don't let it get you down. The cover looks great. But that last piece you said, the piece about the wisdom, when I read those words, it made me think so much about how the Black woman's gut instinct is, at least in my experience professionally, reduced to paranoia. Or she's great, like when these instances happen that our bodies remember, you know what I mean? Our bodies are like, oh, this has happened before. There's something wrong with this. There's something off about this. That bringing that to people's attention often gets a kind of, oh, you're being overly sensitive. You're being paranoid. You're all these things, right? And I just want to, when I read that, I really thought, in an environment where we really trust Black women, paranoia and oversensitivity are not in the vocabulary, right? We've got ancient knowledge running through our bodies. So when my body tells me something's amiss, you better listen because it's been through this before. Do you know what I mean? And I just thought it was a beautiful way to kind of capture that, is what to say.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well. I think, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind for me is, certainly where Rachel, I would argue, I want to know what your response is that your work is by nature all about Black women's bodies, and how to your point, how do they thrive, and then how are they centered in the Black family? Like, how do we think of Black women's bodies within the Black family particularly, which is arguably, like, what a lot of our work is engaged in. And if we think about, certainly from my standpoint, I think about direct legal services and who are the primary people who need support because of the systems that are oppressing them. And I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So in a few ways, well, in all the ways, reproductive justice, I think maybe as virtue of being founded by Black women, centers should center Black women. Now, that doesn't always happen, I will say, but reproductive justice should center Black women at every junction, right? And that's not, I think so many people, well, what should I say? The Black women's experience to me is like the canary in the coal mine. If you can fix the system for us, or if you can address an issue in a way that pedestals Black women and says, okay, this is what this woman needs to thrive, well, then everybody's gonna benefit, right? One area that's come up in my work with Courage, the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice, is we're looking at Black maternal mortality. The rates are abysmal in this country for maternal death in general, but especially Black women. I think in California, a Black woman's 3 to 4 more times likely to die in childbirth. And that number gets, I think, up to 243 times more likely in other areas of the country. Just ridiculous, right? I think everybody's vested in not having mothers die in childbirth. And in a lot of the world, that doesn't really happen so much, right? But because it tends to happen to Black bodies more than others, Black women's bodies more than others, it's an issue that gets swept under the rug and that Black women have to kind of force over and over and over again, like, listen to us, when it comes to birthing as a Black woman, right? I think this pandemic has really pushed us towards reclaiming that ancient wisdom and knowledge, right? So I just saw a New York Times piece about how Black women are choosing home births again. And that's, because the hospitals weren't necessarily safe, but that used to be such a prevalent way, especially where I'm from in Georgia. Black women were delivering babies, and we brought that with us from the times we were captured and enslaved. So I have lost where I'm going, but yes, reproductive justice should center Black women in that, because if we can figure out how to make safe birthing spaces for Black women, all women have safer births, right? And in terms of the Black family, one thing we learned in my work with ESQ Apprentice, we were able to get a COVID care fund going for all the apprentices in our program, right? People who are starting to become lawyers. And we were able to get folks $500 a month for 6 months straight, right?
Wow.
What that did in terms of stability, because these are Black women who are also breadwinners in their families. To know that you have a reliable, guaranteed income during a time when the whole world is on fire. Their kids were thriving, didn't miss a beat in terms of like school application, like the things that you're able to do, everyone was fed. It was one step closer to raising the family in safety and with dignity and respect, that third tenet of reproductive justice. And I think that's what, if we center Black women in those conversations, Black families in those conversations, right? We all win with that.
Yeah.
Can I jump in? I'm really curious, Zoe, to hear you talk about this same question in terms of your work at EBCLC. Kind of what's working, what's the vision for how to make things work better. I don't know, you're the director, you take it any direction you want, but I'd love to hear your voice on this too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's such a privilege to be in this role. And as I said earlier, I'm the new kid. I've been I've been at EBCLC for a little over a year and 2 months. And I'm honored to be an organization that centers holistic care. So this notion, Rachel, that you're just talking about, is how do we take care of this whole person? So we know that, we know that people don't have one reason they're coming. If they're suffering, if there's an eviction that is looming for them, they might also have an immigration issue, or they might also have be having challenges with Social Security, not processing their income on time. They may also have a child who is being disciplined harshly at school. So, it's such a privilege to be at EBCLC, where it's referring in, it's not referring out. It's like you come to us and we will see, we will take care of you in a way that thinks about all the ways in which you're likely to have contact with a system that does not set up to support you. So when I think about trust Black women, when I think about how this notion of, if we could solve for who's bearing the worst, and as I'm sure all of us know, and many of the folks who are watching us know as well, is if you take any social indicator, if you take birth rates, health rates, mortality, education, dropout rates, if you disaggregate the data by race, the folks of color will always be at the bottom in terms of their outcomes. And so this notion of centering race and saying that if we can solve for racial inequities, if we can solve for trans Black women, for example, having the highest unemployment, if we can say that we are going to eradicate the unemployment rates for trans Black women, then we can solve for unemployment for everybody. And I am a strong believer of that, and think that that's just an important piece of how we think about movement lawyering, and how we as lawyers need to push back on or push harder on our government partners who say, we have Proposition 209, or these are the reasons why we can't have a racial category. I've been in conversations with county officials about the COVID vaccine, and thinking through, my staff at EBCLC are the experts at navigating bureaucratic government systems. And we are very fortunate that the county is publishing their race data and showing us what we know. Those of us who are just traveling around Oakland and seeing that it's predominantly white folks in the lines in sites that are deep in Black neighborhoods, and we are seeing that matched with the data that the county is putting out about Black people and Latinx folks are not represented, is not as strongly represented in the vaccines as white folks are. And just thinking about how do we get at that. What was interesting to me yesterday when I was talking to some folks in the county was that they were saying that so I was on a call with other folks who lead organizations that are primarily people of color serving. And the main focus I felt like questioning was to the county folks is just like, we want to know that if we send clients, they won't be turned away. They're looking at the tiers and they think they qualify, but there's this concern about that if they get there, then someone's going to say, you know what, you're not eligible based on like or prove to me that you're eligible. And what I was, articulating to them, to the county, and what I was hearing was that, for folks of color in particular, we have valid reasons to think that county folks or officials, government officials, are going to reject us and have higher scrutiny towards us. And how is that being solved for? And I think that the county is very aware of it and they're interested in engaging it, but they're trying to do it in a race neutral way. And I think that that's what I'm trying to argue is it's not working. It hasn't worked. Race neutrality hasn't worked since it was codified in 1965. And if anything, this time right we're in now, I think we consistently have all the data to show that a race-specific approach is what needs to be done here. But we still just can't pull that trigger. And so from my standpoint, I think, and I'm very privileged and honored to be in this role and thinking through as one of the largest, as East Bay Community Law Center is one of the largest legal service providers in the Bay Area, affiliated with Berkeley Law, which is has an international reputation. How can I push? How can I push and say that, how my approach is more of this, like, how can I help you? I think that you can do this and how can I help you? And that's an active conversation that I'm engaged in right now. I think it also begs the question too of how the personal and the professional get blended in, and I think how COVID has impacted us on a personal level, how we're thinking about vaccines is also can get into the professional and personal. And for me, it goes into this space of what have we learned in this year on a personal level, and what do we expect in the coming year. And I'd love to hear from both of you about how COVID, how shelter in place has impacted you personally. I know Rachel, you earlier gave a shout out to parents. I think all of us, we talked before this call started about being worried about kids coming in during this call. But what are the impacts that you're seeing on a personal level, and as you're thinking about it on a professional level? And I'd also love to hear, if you talk about, Rachel, I appreciate you sharing about the women that you work with that you were able to essentially provide a basic income for at least 6 months. I'd love to hear about what those impacts are for you, and then Savala, also how you're engaging with students, because I think when we think about how we're trying to be in relationship with folks, and particularly with Black women, the Black women who we are in service to, what is that looking like for you, and what are you hearing in terms of the personal and the professional, and how that's being blended in this time period?
Rachel, do you want to go first?
Sure. This pandemic, boy, just in terms of the mental health drain, my daughter, about 3 months in, she was just turned 5 at the time. Yeah, a younger 5. Now she's almost 6 and it's like a completely different baby. But anyway, she just turned 5 and she comes in the room and she says, she looks so worried. And I'm like, what's going on, baby? What's happening? And she's like, I think the police have a virus and they're making everybody sick. And I looked at her and I'm just like, yeah, sort of. Like, that's not that inaccurate, there's the actual virus. And she's just asking the whole time, well, when can I go back to school? When can I be with my friends? When can I do all these things? And she's in this process of finding herself in the images on TV, because I had the news on like 24/7. It was, the mental health drain that this pandemic has put on parents, especially parents of young children. I can't state enough how much we need to be addressing that issue, because what I've seen happen is the professional just kind of, you can't distinguish the two, right? Everything personal it impacts the ability to work professionally. It impacts the approach to the work, the ability to normalize these things when, my children are at home being racialized in ways that are scaring them. When I have to try to manage my emotions so they don't see me like crying. It's less since the new president. But I promise there's a way in which the news, the coverage of what's been going on for the last year, Black women's voices were so notably absent in a way as to depress me, as to make me think, well, maybe I am losing my mind. Do you know what I mean? And I think that, you know, in professional settings, that's a lot of people are going on business as usual when we're being impacted and our children are being impacted in these really real ways. So I've learned from this pandemic that I'm going to have to take care of myself because other folks aren't going to do it. Right? I've learned that, was it Audre Lorde who talked about self-love as radical care? I'm learning to embody that element of Black women wisdom, right? That we've learned, I think my ancestors must have learned quite long ago when you go back over the writings and talk about the emphasis on loving oneself and taking care of yourself as a Black woman. I'm really learning that has to be the prerequisite to any professional, anything. Because if it doesn't support my wellness, if it doesn't support my mental health, it might not be worth pursuing. And learning to let go of those things. It was one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that I've got to spend time with my family, my children, and learn that that's what matters and tomorrow isn't promised. Right? Like being confronted with so much death, especially in our communities, especially in the generation ahead of us, right? To lose so many elders. And in a way to become the elders, right? Like I'm too young to be, to be mentoring younger folks, but that's what the impact of this pandemic has been. It's almost eliminated a generation in some communities. So, I think that incorporating that wellness into my approach to my profession has been the biggest shift I've noticed with the pandemic. And so with the apprentices that I mentioned earlier, that's what that did. That guaranteed basic income, I guess you could call it. That's what that did. That allowed them to say, when the whole world is on fire, okay, I have at least something I can rely on, something that's steady, something that's secure. And from that, you can start to build out a wellness plan because you have something you can rely on. Now that money came from a funder who got it, right? I told them, if I don't come through with support for these women and their families, then there won't be anybody left in this program because that's the reality of what they're going through. You cannot juggle yet another thing over the course of this pandemic. And the funder trusted a Black woman and said, all right, here's $10,000, go redistribute that and make sure that people are retained in this program. So I've also learned that it's gonna take, what Trust Black Women can look like, okay, we're just gonna redistribute some wealth. We're gonna give people the money they need to figure out what they need to do. To partner with people who have wealth and get that, I think is going to be essential. I hope that's what people get from this is, funders especially, that there's such an opportunity here to let people who have embodied the wisdom of Savala's great-great-grandmother, right? Just give it to us. We'll do right by it, don't worry. And in that whole communities can start to get whole and well.
Absolutely. What do you have to add on to that, Savala?
Well, I second everything that you said, Rachel. And I think what I want to say to the people in my life who are not Black women is trust me when I say that I need rest and I need to be taken care of. This is a conversation that I had, I don't know, some time ago with my husband who happens to be white. And thank God he's not from money, because that would really be the clincher. But after the presidential election, I was so exhausted. And the day they called it, after they called it, I was shaking. My body was shaking. And I realized, I came to realize that I had been clenched so tightly, partly because of the former president, partly because of the pandemic, and partly because of, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, racial justice stuff. But And my husband sort of didn't get it. And I had to just articulate for him, this has been a different experience for me than it's been for you, right? Like the past year, the past 4 years. And then he was like, oh, okay, I get it. But intuitively, he didn't make that connection on his own. And so what I want, you know, if I had a magic wand, it would be for like the institutions around me to say, damn, you have really had a long 4 years. Here is a sabbatical. Go take it. You know what I mean? I would love that. That's a different type of trusting Black women that I would love to see. And in terms of work, you know, what I've realized is that there's not enough Black women or Black men at Berkeley Law. This has been a really hard year for me to be remote at the law school. I love the law school and I'm so connected to it and so thankful to work there. But what I have come to realize is when we're in person, I see a lot of Black people at work. I see Black students. I can go over to Rachel's office. I pass the building and facilities folks doing their thing, many of whom are Black. I can go by the administrative assistants part of the law school, many of whom are Black and brown. I can see Black and brown people. Because of kind of where I am in the hierarchy of the law school, when I'm in Zoom meetings, as I have been for the last year, it's mostly just with white people. And so my day has shifted from being a day where in person, I wasn't always the only Black person that I encountered professionally, to almost always being the only Black person in a space. And that's been brutal and exhausting and angering, right? Because this is Berkeley Law, it's a public institution, and I would love for it to do better in this way. And that's something that I've just been kind of trying to understand what, if anything, I can do about that. But it's something that's been really a challenge about the pandemic year for me that I didn't expect professionally.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Zoe?
Yeah, I want to respond to that. Also, we have a question that I think is germane to a good follow-up. So I want to take a moment that we're going to get to that question. Also want to invite folks, if you have a question for Savala, Rachel, and I, please put it in the chat. And if you're not on Facebook, you can email that question to news@ebclc.org. Yeah, on a personal level, I'm not from the Bay. I'm not from California. My parents live in Virginia. I have 2 sisters who I'm very close to, and nieces and nephews, and I haven't seen them in over a year. So it has been very heavy on my spirit. And then also, I have 2 children. Care has generally been good. I'm very happy with the school that's run by a black woman that my preschooler goes to. But then, my family, I'm missing that connection to my family. And as folks know, family connection is just really important. And it's also for me, how I center myself, and how I think about, how my work can make sure that it's lifting up, the Black family relationships that I know about, that I see, and how I see those dynamics play out in my family. And I'll say that, on a very personal level, like, watching them navigate shelter in place, my parents who are in their 70s, my sisters, and then worrying about what my options are if they were to get sick has been really difficult on me. And, knock on wood that, that has not happened, but that has been weighing on me considerably, about what could I do if I needed to support them. Unfortunately, my parents are vaccinated, my sisters are getting so, and I'm on my way. So hopefully that those reunions are forthcoming. I would say the other piece that is really difficult for me is, I started this role. I had 2.5 months of pre-COVID as executive director of EBCLC. And EBCLC's one of its offices is located in South Berkeley, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And I had planned to, and did in my early days, take walks in the neighborhood, and I was getting to know people and introducing myself, particularly like, Black elders who as someone who's not from California, that generation, Rachel, that you were talking about, is I don't have as many contacts to the generation ahead of me because I'm just not from here. Those are not the relationships that I have. And so I was really excited about building those relationships vis-a-vis EBCLC, given where EBCLC is and given how people know EBCLC. And so I think of that as something that I've lost, of how I, as someone who's new to EBCLC, someone who's new to the South Berkeley neighborhood, how am I building relationships with the generation of Black folks who are ahead of me, also a generation of Black folks who, are around the same age as me, who, which a majority of our clients are. How am I building those relationships and how are they seeing me and my leadership? And that's something that I've been struggling with, because Zoom does not, to your point, Savala, like Zoom does not, seeing people and small talk is just not conducive to Zoom. I'm not in the place quite yet of the place. I have a lot of meetings that are majority white, but, I do a lot of internal meetings, and I'm very proud of our multiracial staff. And, a lot of my meetings are not, where I'm not the only person of color, but it is something that I've lost, and I am still struggling with how to show up in a way that, my leadership can be felt for folks who are, enduring so much. And I'm really grateful for, our staff has worked really hard on very, very large scale policy wins this year, from the eviction moratorium to ending homeless encampment sweeps to, having the franchise tax board put money that they garnished, put that back into bank accounts at the height of the pandemic. So I'm very grateful for how hard the staff has worked to, put in protections that have really made a difference, particularly for Black folks. And where I'm struggling is, as I said, is just like how am I building those relationships, and how am I, to the point that we were saying before, but movement lawyering is getting out of the way and making sure that I'm hearing what's needed in this moment. That's the piece that I'm still trying to work out, that I hope is going to get stronger. So a question we have, which is a very easy question. It's not. This is from Kevin, continuing this thread of trusting Black women's knowing, there's a way that we're now seeing in real time individuals, institutions, and corporations co-opting trust Black women in a way that demands proximity to Black women's knowing without any meaningful systemic shifts or transformation. Yep. What does it mean for you all to navigate this? How can massive resource institutions like Berkeley Law disrupt these dynamics in meaningful ways, and how can community hold them accountable?
I'll let Savala lead on that one.
That is a really good question. There's much to say. I mean, the two things that come to mind for me when I heard you read that question, Zoe, were trusting Black women.
Exhaling is the big one. Can all just take an exhale for that question? Let's all just take an exhale.
Yeah, that's a big one. Trusting Black women does not mean putting Black women on committees, and that's it. Right? Because that's just like, don't put me on this committee to elicit my Black female knowledge, and then that's it.
Yeah.
That's not trusting Black women. Maybe that's leaning on Black women. Maybe that's, I don't know, inviting Black women to the table. Maybe that's using Black women. You can view that generously or cynically, but it's not the extent of trusting them, right? It's a first step. So that popped into my head. And then the second thing that popped into my head, this is not my phrase. I heard it on Farai Chidea's podcast, but somebody said, a Black woman said on her podcast, I'm not interested in commitments, I'm interested in consequences. Meaning, it's very easy to vocalize a commitment, right, to racial justice or whatever. But we all know how institutions work. Unless there is some sort of consequence for failing to meet the goal, for failing to, for failing to succeed, I don't know. I don't trust it. I'm just not so interested in commitments anymore. Consequence is a very sharp kind of convicting word, and I'm aware of that. Maybe there's a softer word that is sort of more how I would put it if it were my phrase. But it's true that, like, I mean, a really easy example of this in terms of an institution is asking people to volunteer around racial equity and inclusion rather than, paying someone to do it, so that there is some metric by which to judge the progress, and there is some consequence for failing to make progress. That's a sort of an easy way to get specific about that. But yeah, those two things come to mind. It's more than just being, asking us to be on committees and asking us to tell you what we know. And it's far more than just a mere commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one word that springs to mind is maybe incentivize. Like if the idea, that law schools almost by definition are designed to mean, oh, there's baby number 2. I knew it would happen at least once. I knew it would happen. But the idea that law school doesn't really incentivize supporting Black women or like pathways that support Black women there. Black women, I think, are one of the most educated groups in the United States, but that also means we're among the most indebted, right? So we tend to carry a lot of debt assigned to the education. So if you were trying to create an environment where Black women could thrive, you might eliminate debt from the equation. Right? Like
I agree.
That's kind of what, in theory, ESQ Apprentice is kind of setting out to do. Is like, what happens when you create a pathway to lawyering that is debt-free? Well, we get over 600 emails a month. Like, how can I learn about this? I'm in Paris, I'm in Washington State, I'm in New Zealand, I'm in all these places, and this is the only thing I've heard of that says, oh, Black women debt-free lawyer, let's go, I want to be involved in that. Right? So you can incentivize in that way by creating environments, debt-free paths to becoming a lawyer. You can incentivize, clerkships and corporate law is kind of where law students get pushed. But you can incentivize practical training and working in low-income communities, have reward structures in place for those things, and not, of course, you can't just do it willy-nilly because people bring all their isms with it. But if there is, you can get more credit for the courses Savala's teaching, right? you get more credit for the courses that help the critical theory courses. You can create those incentives within a structure that says, okay, you can come to this school and choose not to learn about race, but the people who really want to get ahead and make this, become conscious lawyers, we have all these incentives in place to say, okay, this is how you can choose your path, you can access this, and it'll encourage more people to become more conscientious. I think.
Can the incentive be our collective liberation?
That's what it is for me. I was talking to my husband about this not too long ago, and I was like, can't it just be the belief? And he's the logic guy. He's always like, nah, I gotta do the calculations and everything. So he was like, well, it can be the belief, but if you don't have the belief backed up with these then it's never gonna work. We disagree on these things. But yes, I that's enough for me. But I think there's some very real processes that can be put into effect, and they're not. I think one of the disservices that are a lot of narratives around this topic, one of the disservices is that it's just so hard. And it's not easy, trust me. Like, I've been doing this work about a decade, and it's like, ugh, it's like I'm slogging through mud sometimes trying to get anything done. It's not easy. But for like the funder who I mentioned who got it, it was like, okay, 10,000, bam. And so for the institution that gets it, I think it can be less complicated. It's hard for me, the only Black woman in any given setting, to try to turn, a ship dedicated to the status quo, full of all its racism, sexism, ageism, all of these isms. It's hard for me to do that alone. But for the captain of the ship or the ship itself, you can kind of start to turn it around when you have all the infrastructure in place. So to Savala's earlier point, I think a lot of it's about the will. the will to get it done, whether it be an incentive structure that rewards like with credit, or one that rewards with just the idea that you're going to have, help secure the collective freedom of all folks when you focus on supporting Black women.
Mhm. I'm definitely in the middle of the incentive and consequence. I think, being real, like the consequence is we keep doing the same shit we've been doing since 1965, expecting, expecting police to stop killing Black people, expecting, magically Black women's, maternity rates to just, to improve. And I am very critical. Yes, there's been a lot. We have a lot of gains under a Biden administration, but there was a baseline that was established by Trump that we have got to leap beyond, and we cannot just settle for incremental change. So I think, the consequences, especially for folks who were the writers of those statements and the people thinking, what should we say in this solidarity statement? I think the consequence needs to be, do we really want things to just stay the same? And maybe people are going to answer that yes. And I think the incentive is, it's like, for folks who were awakened during that time, it's just like, no, we don't. So we have to put in that hard work. I think, I just want to do like a time check. We're gonna wrap up in a few, and I did want to say, if there's any more questions, please put those in, and we'll try to address those. And I appreciate some of the ones we've got. I'll try to tie in some of the questions we got into some final remarks. But I think, so there's two things that this rise to mind for me. Is one, like I'm in a nonprofit organization that, and I fundraise. I'm a fundraiser for our organization. And so just thinking about the institutions, philanthropic organizations that are predominantly white, that predominantly many have liberal folks who want to do the right thing, and the conversations that I have with them about how to do that. And I also think about an employer. What does it mean to be a Black woman employer in a large institution? EBCLC has 80 staff, so we are essentially a large institution. So what does that mean for me? Like, how do I think about that as an employer, Black womanhood, and all the pieces that I hold in the political professional life, and also as an employer? And to the first piece about philanthropy, I appreciate that there has been a lot of, Black-led, and how do we think about Black-led organizations? How do we think about funding organizations that center grassroots organizing in Black communities? And I think and I think there are people who are doing really hard work on that. And I just want to honor that, lift it up, and saying thank you. And that certainly is the work that, that makes me going into meetings, the work that folks are doing and making this on a discourse and philanthropic circles is just really critical to the fundraising that I'm trying to do and the work that I'm trying to do. I think that holding people accountable and getting shifts is a dance for me. In funder meetings, I trying to get as much background on the funder as possible, and seeing, how are they going to respond when I talk about centering Black women? And, do I say equity or racial equity, or women of color versus, Black women? Like so to the question about how do I navigate on the daily, that is exactly how I navigate on the daily. Like, what is there anything in this person's background that leads me to believe that they are going to be someone who can really hear like what is needed, and are willing to take what I say to them and push back against the power institutions that are behind them, whether that's the board or their boss, or things that I say going to be things that are going to be, they're going to say, oh, that's too hard, like this is not. I think one funder told us recently, you're way ahead of where we are. We're like 2 years behind in terms of your thinking on liberation of Black youth.
A lot. Yeah.
And so that's how I navigate that.
Catch up.
I know. And I think, so to the extent that, I would just say folks who are not Black women, when you are on boards, when you have friends who are on boards, when you have friends you have friends who can move money. Let's just say that, whether that's a grandparent, someone who's at a philanthropic organization, someone who's at a corporation that has money that is looking for, how do we make this state? We say we issued this statement and we haven't done anything, so what should we do? People need to think about their leverage with those and their influence. Like, everybody has discretion, and this is a big thing that I talk about when I do racial equity trainings. Like, this is not because it's so hard. It's easy to say, well, this is why I can't do this. it's much harder to say, oh, I actually do have some power, and I can leverage the power by having this conversation and then following up with that person saying, this is really important to me. So I think that that's a main ask of people, is for everyone to be thinking about who is supportive of and who everyone who uses that hashtag, if everyone who used the Trust Black Women hashtag really, interrogated their influence, and not only had an initial conversation with someone who may have more influence than them, but then to follow up with them to make sure that they had all the information and tools that they need to actually make things real. I think that would be, that would be immense, and that would be huge. And then certainly, in the hunt that as Rachel and I are in terms of fundraising, it would make our work a lot easier. And again, I just want to say I really appreciate the organizing that is being done to support Black-led organizations. And then the other piece I want to just hold as, as an institution myself, like what does it mean to be a Black woman employer, and to say that, okay, my organization is not where I'd want it to be if I was an employee of this organization. How do I move things in a way that, a spouse that lives in all the values that I have, as a professional and as a person. And one of the things that I've been sitting with is, so I'm as a Black woman in an organization that's predominantly not Black women. How do I navigate making space, and then asking for space? And so one of the things that I did, early on at EBCOC was recruiting, we had a predominantly white male board, so I recruited predominantly women of color to join the boards. That was part of me helping to make space for me, but also making space for this organization and how I think this organization should grow. And then similarly at the staff level, how do I, kind of learn from our staff, like what their needs are in terms of understanding racial equity and in terms of understanding their relationship between their clients in a way that is that does center race. That doesn't just say, we are just offering services and we're thinking about anyone who comes in our doors, and we're not thinking about the racial dynamics that may be in play in our own relationships or in our relationships with our colleagues. That's the harder space that I'm navigating, that I'm privileged to navigate, and I feel really good about. But that is the work that I think is really important, and that I would invite people who are at other institutions, whether you are at another nonprofit, whether you are a student in the law school. I think, this theme of interrogation. How are we interrogating where we can continue to be learning, where we can do better? I think that everyone's better off with that. And if you think that, if you think that you are above reproach, or if you think that you are, it's too hard, then you're essentially, mimicking some of the same practices that are really, again, making it very difficult for Black women generally.
Right. I mean, Zoe, I think you said it, what you described is that you set intention to interrogate, right? And I feel like in that regard, creating an environment that shows that one trusts Black women as leaders of various institutions is as simple as setting an intention, as making a choice, right? That you're going to interrogate that in really meaningful ways, not just give it lip service, but that you're dedicated to asking and re-asking and re-asking and putting it up on the wall, making sure you're asking yourself every morning, am I creating an environment where Black women can feel safe and be dignified and be respected? Is that what I'm doing today? I mean, I think as Black women leaders, that's what we do because we have to, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, I guess you could not set that intention, but just living in a Black woman's body is like, I need to be asking every day. And in terms of my accountability to my sisters, like, am I doing enough to support you? Has to be a part of every decision I make, right? And I think that that's the intention that a lot of folks got to sit with and set. Like, what am I doing today? That don't wait for a Black woman to come to me. Don't put the burden on her, or, don't put the burden on them to tell me what everything that needs to be fixed. Let me interrogate, let me learn. One of my good friends, we had this really charged meeting with a white-led organization, and my friend's a Black woman who needs another organization in the Midwest. And, they're like, all right, we're going to have a good conversation. We're going to get to the bottom of this white supremacy thing, right? So we all get in this meeting and we're talking through things. And she made a really good point. She said, you all don't even have a pad and paper.
Mm.
How did you come to learn if you didn't bring the tools for learning? Right? So I think I was just like, hey, that's a good point. Are they just recording this mentally? Like, you have to, as leaders of these institutions and organizations, set the intention, but then interrogate it daily, just like you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question. Someone said, how do you, if you're not sure about how to identify your place of influence, like how do you go about doing that? Um, I think, not to be facetious, I think LinkedIn is a very useful tool. It's something, so as someone who fundraises, when I meet a new contact, the first thing I will do is go to LinkedIn in many cases and see the people that we have in common. So to the extent that people are thinking about who they're in relationship with, where did you graduate your law school? So all of our alums who are at Berkeley Law, I'm thinking about people who would pick up your phone call before they pick up mine because you are an alum. I just think that there's an easy way of, one, just looking at your personal connections, and then two, think about all the institutions that have endorsed you on your journey. And so for me, that's thinking about, my college, my law school, my previous employers, and thinking about how there are the ways that those institutions have provided you some capital, and how do you use that capital that you've gotten from those institutions? How do you use that capital in service to trusting Black women? That's where I would start, and that's certainly a place that I have started with too, as thinking through my own privilege, because there are, the affiliations that I have, even currently with Berkeley Law, I have to think about and want to interrogate how I can be using the capital that this status gives me in a way that is in service to Black women. Anything to add on that, Savala and Rachel, any how-to advice you have before we wrap up?
I love what you said, Zoe. I mean, I think of that question for myself in terms of, where do people listen to me, right? Like,
Right.
where can I talk and somebody listens? And that's whatever that space is, whether it's with my mom or with a colleague or with a magazine where I've published writing, that's a place where I can flex a little bit of power. It's more complicated sometimes when you're thinking about yourself intersectionally, right? Like, we all had a conversation before this meeting where I talked about, I hope nothing I say is going to be like a career limiting disclosure, so it's depending on who you are, it's like a balance of considering where you have power and like how protected you are in that space. Like, those two things kind of added together can give you a sense of how much you're comfortable speaking or using your voice. And I just want to surface that it can be a complicated question depending on who you are.
Yeah, I would just add that, you've heard it if you hadn't heard it before, you've heard it from Black women today. It is difficult to be the only, as my friend Dr. Karen Scott calls it, to be the only in these institutions takes an extra toll. If you are in spaces where you are not the only, but someone else is, that's an opportunity to advocate for, to push the boundaries on, to say, let me talk to this person, let me figure out what they need from me in terms of advocacy. Let me do my homework and figure out just what I can say without even getting personal experiences. Like, if our institution has only hired one Black person in its 40-year history, I can bring that up as a problem, because I know that to be the only anywhere is a problem, and we need to talk about that a little bit more, right? Like, you can push those kinds of boundaries, and if we don't, back to the consequences question, we risk the perpetuation of the status quo. And again, if you haven't heard it before, you're hearing it today. That does not work for Black women. It doesn't work for so many people. What just business as usual. So we've really got to rethink the whole shebang if we're gonna get to a place of collective freedom.
Yeah, I've paused at times in my life where I have been in a private space where things were talked about that I feel like people in the community should know, that this is how policy actually gets made, or this is how decisions get made. When I'm in those situations, and I'm certainly in those situations at Berkeley Law as well, is it's like, how do I think about making sure that people, how am I showing up in a way that if I wanted someone who's an ally, who said they were an ally of mine, to be thinking about how can I show up for, you know, Black women. And I invite people, to the extent that you're a part of conversations or decisions that are made in a closed door and an opaque process, that is definitely a space where you can be thinking, you should be applying a racial justice analysis. So in the final moments, Savala and Rachel, you know this, I told you need to listen to Here to Slay, which is a podcast that Tressie McMillan Cotton and Roxanne Gay do that really talks about a lot of the things we're talking about today in terms of centering and trusting Black women. They always end their podcasts with this question, which I think is wonderful, and I would like you to answer. What can we, so Savala, what can Rachel and I do to help you